The discussion today concerns a shift in architectural thinking that has become increasingly difficult to ignore. Namely, what happens when the site is no longer understood as a simple plot on a plan, but as a living environment shaped by overlapping forces. Environmental pressures, societal transformations, and technological acceleration unsettle the traditional anchors of practice. The brief, the regulation, the boundary line still matter, but none can serve as a stable foundation on their own. Architecture is guided now by broader conditions. Few have examined this shift more incisively than our guest today. Michael Hensel, architect, researcher, and professor at TU Wien, has developed several frameworks that situate architecture within the environments it inhabits and transforms. Through performance-oriented architecture, geomorphic tectonics, and ecological envelopes, he challenges us to reconsider what counts as site, how programs might emerge from conditions rather than prescriptions, and how a project formulates its problematic in a complex world. So where do we begin when the ground itself becomes dynamic? How do programs arise through the interplay of forces and use? And what does it mean to articulate the problematic that responds to the critical zone we now inhabit? These are some of the themes that will guide us in the episode ahead. I'm your host, Irinel Pintilia. Welcome to Contrapposto. First of all, thank you for joining us today. Before we dive into the questions, just to briefly set the stage, which is for the larger series that is now happening for this first season of episodes. So we're trying to understand the interrelation of these three fundamental components: site, program, and problematic. So now everyone has a general sense of what a site is and what a program might be. They are somewhat familiar terms, but in this series, we are trying to move away a bit from the familiar and the habitual readings of the terms. So I try to approach them from this angle of entanglement, how one frames the other, how they co-produce each other, and how a design or architecture emerges from their triangulation. And the problematic in particular, I think, tends to be the most difficult term to articulate. It's rarely straightforward, and I use this word somewhat deliberately, problematic and not problem. It could easily just be the theme or the topic or the concept, but I feel what I have in mind is something closer to something that carries a slightly different weight. So not just, as I said, not just a problem and not simply an attitude towards the problem, but a constellation of issues, questions, tensions, and inquiries that could shape the intellectual and the strategic core of the project. So the goal is to unpack all these three components, so how they relate to each other and how they carry different loads, how they are articulated differently depending on each guest's background and way of working. And with your work in particular, Professor Hensel, I think it's a central position that we have today, and it can be fundamental to rethinking all three of them. So across your research and practice, you have performance-oriented architecture, geomorphic tectonics, the Designing Environment series, Ecolobes, and Vienna Story Studio, just to name a few. It seems that you consistently question how architects define sites, how they challenge programs, and how programs could emerge from conditions rather than just briefs. And you emphasize how, I think this is my impression of your work so far, that the problematic helps navigate the complexity of both. This would be the overall topic for the series, and we can jump in medias res directly with a site. You expanded in your work quite beyond what the parcel is. So how do you describe what a site is today? Or what should be a site?
Okay, if you may, I will first take a step away from that question, and then I will take a step back into that question. In your series, you will look at very different takes on these, let's call them concepts that we work with. And to my mind, the approach is always aligned with a worldview by a particular designer, architect, planner, scholar, writer, whatever. And by and large, we must understand that this worldview gives a certain kind of bias to the work. And if we do not take account of this, most people might not even have thought about their overarching approach. And then we can run into difficulties with conversations about certain topics because we come from such different understandings of how we view the world that even if we seemingly agree on a certain term or a certain concept, its entire role, its entire framing is different. So before I go to your question about site or program or problematic or any other term, I should perhaps say something about where I'm coming from. Maybe less in terms of what is my particular worldview, but maybe a little bit more in terms of what are the overarching motivations. And I would like to lay this bare so that the context for everything that comes afterwards is somewhat given. I come from an angle that is particularly concerned with the effects and consequences of human transformation of our world. That can be understood as a global statement. It can also be understood as a local statement. So there are different levels to this whole thing. But many researchers have shown that human transformation, and among that urbanization and construction, are among the key drivers of what we might call environmental degradation today. For me, this takes absolute precedence as a topic because here we're talking about the very resources, the very conditions which enable us to exist. The moment we start scratching on those conditions, the moment we start altering them, every other discussion becomes almost secondary, because the first thing we want to ensure, of course, is our well-being. And for our well-being in this world, we must take care of a great number of different things, also the well-being of other species and so on. So sustainability, livability, well-being, equity, stewardship, all these kinds of terms would perhaps frame in a way the direction that I'm coming from. Having said that, we can now return to a question of site. Site in itself, in preparation of this meeting, I looked up the etymology of the word, basically indicates place or position. This can be a dot on a map.
Yes.
Can also be a line around an area. And that very moment that we start describing this line, we have to somehow be aware of the consequence of that line. Be that a line that indicates an interior as opposed to an exterior. This comes back to some of the listed questions that you have later on, or be that a site that says, here's the area of intervention within your control, and everything beyond it is beyond your control and beyond your concern. Or it can be a series of overlapping territories where there are filters, where there are lines that are permeable to certain things and impermeable to other things. I will give you a funny example, but I have to sort of generalize a little bit so that I don't get into legal issues. Several years ago, I heard a presentation somewhere where somebody was talking about particular aerodynamic condition on a site that was adverse to being there. And they designed a project there, and that person very happily announced, so with our project, we resolved this bad aerodynamic condition here. It now is 500 meters further down another direction. So you, in a way, this is a funny story and one might smile about it, but this is very indicative about what we're doing. For as long as we have solved on our little patch the problem we were asked to solve, it's really sort of easy enough for us to say, well, yeah, no, the problem exists somewhere else, but it's no longer my responsibility because it's beyond the line drawn, which indicates my responsibility. The problem with the notion of site today is that we simply take it for granted and we never challenge it because it is so ingrained in our particular understanding of what is to be done, how our activities are contractually and legally framed, how responsibilities are distributed, how disciplines are defined, that it is very hard to challenge it. So if I were to say, I have to take responsibility for the aerodynamic condition 500 meters in that direction now because I have caused it, is a major step away and beyond how we understand site today. So to me, site, plot, and parcel are not necessarily synonymous. Plot and parcel are very clearly defined. This piece of land of a certain extent.
Yes, and then
Each
the
site,
authorities come and then they say this is the linear that you must not cross, and this is the height that you must not cross, and this is the parcel for an architect today.
yes, but what I want to get at is that if we already have a term for a defined piece of land, namely plot or parcel, then maybe we can release the term site because it's already covered by the terms plot and parcel. We can redefine what site is. The site of my intervention could be defined as the extent in space and in time that I will impact upon with my intervention. That is then the site total, and that is somewhat complex to capture. So this will be always dismissed as a kind of holistic, all-inclusive, but unfortunately pointless undertaking because you cannot account for everything. But what you can do is you can account for more than we typically do. Yeah, so for instance, I could say, maybe I should care if I project for that site a 5-story underground parking garage for what will happen with the soil. Soil is an important resource. It shouldn't just go onto a lorry and then whatever. It could be accounted for. So I could begin to account for the flux of materials in and out of the site. And I think contemporary models of circularity already do that. So we could say that circularity has already challenged what we might understand as the site of our intervention. Because taking things from a flow and feeding it back into there all of a sudden expands the area in space and in time that we affect. And maybe that could become something that we call site. Because what the plot is, we already know.
Yes.
But site as a concept could begin to expand past that parcel line, past that plot line, which says this is the property on which a certain intervention will take place.
Yes, I think the parcel is the site understood in a narrow sense, and then we need to move to a broader, not a definition, but understanding of what a site is to incorporate different layers that might be significant for the project. if we're reading it just for a specific project.
Well,
And
I would suggest a slight modification, not just significant for the project, because then we put the project back into
Yes.
the prime position, but also for all the conditions caused by the project. Yeah, so it's basically taking account of the consequences of an intervention. Yeah, so it's not just for the project, it's also something because of the project.
yeah, that's actually a great input now, because you have started now for a few years a series at Springer. It's called Designing Environments, and now I think you've reached 5 or 4 volumes, the last being published this year. And in your introduction volume, you speak about a very interesting term called the critical zone. And I believe that what you just explained right now, with not for the project, but because of the project and what happens around the project after the project is being done, relates to this designing environments pretty much. So it's not just designing the project as it is, but designing the environment in which the project is located. So yeah, I think you've already explained this concept briefly, what a critical zone is, in both in your terms and how it's understood in environmental sciences.
Yeah, I can maybe just quickly refer back somewhere around the year 2000. The National Research Council in the United States identified certain areas that are of primary importance for future research within the earth and geosciences. And they basically coined the notion the critical zone, meaning this kind of thin layer around our planet that generates the necessary resources for life, and that basically is the place of and that sustains life. And basically it has been described that there are a number of different systems which are interacting: air, organisms, soil, water, and rock. You could also refer to this as the biosphere, the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, which is basically everything to do with water, the pedosphere, everything to do with soil, the lithosphere, everything to do with rock, etc., and their interactions. And when we have the interactions, we have, of course, on the one hand, the rock-soil cycle, the tectonic cycle, and the hydrological cycle. These make up what is called the geological cycle. And then we have the hydrological cycle, carbon cycle, and nitrogen cycle, making up what is called the biochemical cycle. So we have basically systems and their interaction. And we interact in that. One simple example, we interact with the soil on the site by basically removing it or by leveling the site, and then by maybe removing the soil because we want to build underground spaces. In Norway, where for instance, the soil layer is very thin, this often means also interfering with the rock layer, basically flattening entire terrains, etc. That means that before that, the vegetation has gone out, and now the water has nowhere to go into the ground, so we increase flooding somewhere else. And you can see very quickly, by what we call preparation of site, we often commit a fairly negative thing upon what we might call a local environment. We might think about the urban hydrological cycle in relation to the natural hydrological cycle. We are only looking at a very small portion of the water, and most of it is to do with how do we treat our polluted water in consequence of having used it. But when it comes to flooding problems, we still are lacking good ways of modeling what it actually means to take water out here, or to seal the soil there, and to put the water back into the system there. Because these are really vast, multi-scale issues, and we don't really know quite exactly how to deal with it. But I think we shouldn't shy away from it. We should deal with it. What happens with this is that the notion of site all of a sudden explodes. All of a sudden, we are quite quickly from a small plot on a city scale or even on a regional scale, where the cumulative consequences of individual actions arrive. And at that point, one way of shying away from the whole problem would be to say, well, I only contributed 1/millionth of the problem. And what can I do about the rest of it? Reducing 1/millionth of a problem is already great, and maybe somebody else might follow, and then maybe somebody else might follow. So the problem is that this can only then be dressed into legislation if we have ways of working top down. But we don't have these ways yet, because we do not really have these fully integrated multi-scale ways of modeling and simulating the consequences. But what we can do in the meantime is we can work bottom up in a cumulative fashion. Everybody can do something, where the small little parcel, what we do on there is considered as part of the larger whole, and where every contribution matters. So the issue with the critical zone, also as Bruno Latour has shown in many of his writings, is that the systems and the processes of the critical zone don't adhere to any boundaries, not to national boundaries, not to plot boundaries, not to any kind of cultural boundaries or whatever. But at the same time, there's also a very interesting book by Etienne Benson called Surroundings. He actually showed how critical zone research, nevertheless, does not mean that we have to deal with the entirety of the global environment, but that we can look at local environments. We can look at a delta area of a river as part of a hydrological zone, if you like. Or we can look at particular kinds of valleys or other kinds of somewhat contained, still connected on a global scale, but also somewhat specific and contained conditions in an area, let's say. Area can be larger or smaller. So I think the point is not really to connect any intervention to a vast global scale, but to try and understand its role on a kind of area scale that describes a locally specific environment. Yeah, I think that would be an intermediary scale that we can start working on, that we can develop concepts and approaches and working methods for, that we can start to think about if we write a brief. This will probably later on come back to the question of program. If we write a brief for a project, what are actually the implications? Because now we have to go beyond and 5 square meters for a coffee kitchen and 5 square meters for a copy machine and 5. All of a sudden, it's like, what happens to the soil? What kind of vegetation will we have? What does it mean for the microclimate of the area? And so on. So from one step to the other. It also makes very clear that, for instance, the discussions that we have on carbon issues are important, and they are definitely a very important first step, but it's a step that's also lacking, because we really need to think further about the carbon cycle and its interaction with other cycles in the critical zone. Should therefore everybody, every architect and every planner become a kind of genius in earth sciences and life sciences and all that? No. But I think we need to seek disciplinary alliances with those areas so that our interventions can become more informed in that sense. We need to increase the palette of disciplines within the teams that are making important determinations for areas.
And do you
We
think
need to also,
this
it cannot just be bottom up. We also need to give some sense of framing to the individual planner and architect.
But this needs to have some effects or to begin with the education of the students, I believe. So this cannot already just happen in practice. This needs to start from research and from teaching.
Yes, but I also think I think it was perhaps Foucault who wrote very nicely about how we are, for a while, no longer in this kind of very clear sequence of life stages. Now, sort of you go to school and then you go to do your training, or you study, and so then one period follows the other.
Yeah.
And then after education, you go into your work life, and then you do that. It's much more fluent. I think that the incredible developments that we see across the disciplines everywhere beg for lifelong education. They beg for a permanent rethinking, reskilling, retooling. It's a different way of operating. It's one where you do not collect all your key competencies in 4 or 5 years, and then what you do for the next 40 years is just exercise them. That no longer works. It has never quite worked because architects always had to learn the latest fire regulations, the latest thing about vapor issues, the latest thing about how to write a bill and how to charge according to the regulations, contracts of architects, and so on. So we are familiar as a profession with the need for retraining, but the retraining needs to be somewhat more wholesome and integrative and over a wider range of disciplines. That releases a little bit the pressure on the first of 4 or 5 years, but it doesn't take it entirely away. We need to rethink our curricula, and we need to lay the basis in the training of young planners and architects such that they develop the ability for self-directed learning and self-directed, in a way, research to up their performance as the requirements become more complex, as we have to fulfill more requirements in terms of sustainability and client ideas and stakeholder involvement and participation and all of that. And in the end, how are we supposed to bring these things together if the seed for that kind of critical, reflective, and self-directed learning is not laid early on? Some of my colleagues claim that this is what takes place in the training or in the design training where you do studios. And to an extent, I agree. The studio is a place where synthesis ought to and should take place. But what I don't see so much is that we really fulfill, in the best sense, in our discipline in Central Europe, the requirement of the Bologna Agreement to teach master's students the ability for self-directed learning and self-directed research. I think we're lacking there, and we're lacking also in the outlook of lifelong learning. What I want to say is we shouldn't make for young people the task sound insurmountable. You don't have to take everything up in 4 or 5 years because you have your entire professional life to do that. But you need to try to nourish certain abilities and competencies, at least in their seed form, so that you're ready for what will happen in the next 40 years. That's my concern, really. Yeah? So we have to rethink the syllabi, the curricula, but we don't have to imagine to train all of this in 4 or 5 years. That's not possible.
Yeah, I mean, I can speak from my own experience that the curricula is already, the curriculum at TU is already quite heavy, and students are already complaining that they have, it is an integrative and it is an overarching education. So we get insights from everywhere, but yeah, and I agree with you. It tends to become a burden that we need to master everything that we're being taught in 3 or 4 or 5 years.
Yeah, we are in a context now where our profession, where our discipline will fundamentally change because the main work is shifting away from designing new buildings or planning all the time new urban quarters. In some places, that's still the case, but in other places, it's not. Adaptation of the existing is becoming ever more important. But I do also think that at some point, we will begin to realize that the division between the architectural object, the building, and its surroundings, as we are working it today, is not adequate to address the issue of climate change, environmental and ecological degradation in our cities, and thereby human health and well-being. Our profession is in flux, even if we don't perceive it so much yet, because there are also very strong conservative trends in architecture, that try to hold us at the point where we are. But at the same time, this tension is getting bigger. What is it really that we need to learn? So my point would be not so much to add more stuff into an already overstretched syllabus, but to pay close attention to how our profession is already changing and how it might be changing in the next 5 to 10 years even more. Maybe past that, it's hard to predict, but I think that the way in which syllabi and curricula are discussed is way too clunky. We need to be far more light-footed. We need to be able to rearrange curricula on a 2-year, 3-year mode, and not just make some adjustments that needs to go through 25 committees that cannot agree. That's just, in a way, disciplinary suicide, if you like. Yeah, so there's something about how we operate and administer the teaching, how we select content, and what are really some core competencies that help people to basically change according to necessity, to pick up new things, to pick up new skills, tools, concepts, approaches, and so on. So the most important thing is, how do you do teaching that creates an open, curious, and critically reflective mind that can continue to operate like this and uptake things over 40, 50 years in profession. So please don't misunderstand what I'm saying as loading even more stuff in there. I think we have to critically review what's in there and then basically do something that is manageable, but also relax a little bit and understand that some of the things may come in another period in 4 or 5 years, and then another period in 10 years, and so on.
But do you think we as architects would need to have a more broad, generalistic view on things, or do we need to specialize? This happens. Should this happen in our studies, or this over specialization happens afterwards in our practice, depending on the route that we are willing to take?
Most questions that use the word "or" tend to be not so useful. I'm telling you why, because it's basically saying it's either black and black is fixed and we know what black is, or it's white and white is fixed and we know already what white is. So is it that or is it that? And that's why I think these things are not so helpful. I would basically say we need a little bit of each of those things. But how do we, what stands behind it? What is the core competency? What's the core skill that we have to have behind it? I think this is an important conversation, but let me take this to one of the terms that you have for these sessions. Let me take that to the term program, because when you sent it to me, you really made me very, very nervous, because program has been such a big issue when I went through my training, especially in London, and then it somehow largely disappeared. And this word has different meanings again for different people in the different regions of the world that have gone through different kinds of training and so on. And it shows you really how concepts evolve or devolve depending on the worldview that you're becoming part of as part of your, or exposed to as part of your education. So when I did my post-professional master degree in London, that was in the first half of the 1990s, program was a big issue. And before that, program was also a big issue, but what is program really? Is program something hard, fixed? Is that where we seek control over our intervention? Is that where we call a room living room and wish it to be fixed as such? Is that where we call a building department store and we wish it to be fixed like this? Already at the time when I studied, Chumi introduced next to program event. He basically said you can commit murder in the kitchen, or yeah, so basically something, the room was not planned for that. So there's something that is planned, that's a kind of control fantasy. And then there's something that takes place, which is not planned. It cannot even be foretold. It just takes place. And it doesn't even have to be murder. It can just be a building gets adapted and the living room is all of a sudden a kitchen, or the department store is all of a sudden a parking garage. Yeah, so I think that program as something that can be enforced by the architect is somewhat a fantasy, but it's also a needed operational tool, because if you don't tell me that you want me to design a parking garage for you, then what am I doing? I'm not looking at the turning radii of the vehicles. I'm not making the spots where they can fit in. I'm not providing the electricity supply or whatever is needed. So it's an important piece of information for me at that point in time, for the design to make sense. So in that sense, there's now a number of words that come up that may not all indicate the same thing, and certainly not across different educational cultures. And that is program, function, purpose, use, and so on. So in my education, in my post-professional master, there was one point where we really totally went over the top with program, where we really went into the minutest thing of each activity and putting a provision and making all that sort of hyper specificity to the purpose of a building, down to where you sit and which button you press, sort of.
Yeah.
And that is, on the one hand, an interesting exercise, because it basically tells you, do you have a good grasp of requirements across scales in space, and do you know what to do? But it totally leaves out of consideration. We even did 24-hour programs for buildings and all the rest of it. And Ben van Berkel did a project for a couple that has a 24-hour cycle, of which they never seem to diverge. Yeah, so you see, there is a point where useful information might turn into control fantasy, and where all of a sudden we're losing out of sight the temporal dimension and the need for adaptation and change, even that habits of the people that we design for might change from one week to the next. Somebody might just all of a sudden decide to go to the gym from New Year's onwards. And so the storage room turns into a mini gym at home, things like this. So I'm trying not to relativize. I'm trying to say this is a kind of a skill to move between specificity on the one hand and embracing the openness and the need for adaptation on the other hand. And this can be applied to really everything you wish. This can even be applied to ecological strategies for larger sites. What are you doing there? Is this a degraded environment? You're starting, in a way, a new ecological system, or is there one on site, but it's poor? Do you want to transition it to another state? Or what is it really? What are the strategies? The temporal dimension So we don't just have this. This is the interesting thing. Site is in a way predominantly understood as a spatial dimension. Program, or through spatial dimensions. Program is typically understood through functional dimensions. Where is the temporal dimension? Yeah, and the interaction between spatial, functional, and temporal dimensions. This is really, for me, an issue. This would be, for me, also a core thing to teach in architecture today. That we don't just learn that there is something like hard control programming and there is something about laissez-faire and a kind of more open-ended approach, but that we basically need to negotiate between these. We need to set things up such that the specific requirements are fulfilled, but that adaptability is possible. So basically what we call design for adaptation. And that requires a good grasp on a multitude of spatial, temporal, and functional scales.
But tying it back a bit with your view on designing environments in the critical zone, should the program also take into consideration the microclimates, the ground conditions, the material behavior, so that the environmental forces and the functional requirements co-produce the program? Not just the uses of space, but how the environment where it's located has a say in.
Due to my own education, I have problems assigning the word program to that, because I have a certain understanding of what program is. That's and having struggled with this, and having struggled also with the underlying division between form and function, basically program was basically something that was pursued by a certain type of architect, and the kind of notion of program as a fantasy was pursued by another type of architect, and all the rest of it. Because of this, I try to tackle the question of performance in a way, and I don't look at performance as in hard engineering terms. I don't think of it as here's the heating or the thermal performance of a building, and now we need to optimize this. For this we have other words. Yeah, they are already established. We can talk about functionality and all the rest of it. For me, it was, again, what we spoke about earlier on. Plot and parcel already define the surrounded piece of land on which something might take place. And site could be released to be more encompassing. And I think for me, the same thing goes with performance. Performance is something that could be understood as something more released and more working over different spatial, temporal, and functional scales. It's also not synonymous with function, and therefore not synonymous for me with certain hard control notions of program. Because as much as you calculate your building physics, the moment that your tree stand is 10 meters further away because some pipeline was discovered, your microclimate is already affected. Yeah, so there is this, or let's say if the predicted heating up of the environment gets counteracted by an increasing amount of heavy rain events. You thought you planned for dry hot, and it's kind of maybe dry wet, and you haven't really thought about it, so there are always these things which are happening because of the complexity of everything interacting, that if you just go for hardcore optimization, it just doesn't work. All these experiments that we see of wonderful new cities built in the desert, I'm not going to name any now, you will always see that the proponents, even though they tell you one narrative, they always have all the kind of standard security systems in place. It's like wearing suspenders and the belt at the same time, because they just simply come from a kind of optimization perspective, where basically all the conditions need to be as laid out. If anything is beyond your input into your simulation, any external conditions beyond the input of your simulation, then somehow things might all of a sudden not work, and they may fail to work on a significant level because some critical limit has been reached. Yeah, so I always wonder whether some past experiences, Pietro Laureano talks about how certain towns have emerged from setting up small oases as a way of planting a seed, changing a microclimate, reacting to it, and building on what you observe, whether that could be a good model. However, this is not how we populate the planet today. So all of these historical models need to be looked at from kind of more from a filtering perspective, in which we try to gain usable knowledge that can be adapted and used in contemporary environments. So program, as I said, program for me, if program is meant the way I have learned it, I shy away a little bit from it because it comes from a hard control engineering optimization perspective, which is I don't believe in as an exclusive approach. If program is simply meant as the design brief, here's your design brief, please make sure that these things are fulfilled, then I'm all the way with you. Then I would say, yes, in the design brief, we should start finding things about if, for instance, the site is ecologically sensitive and we want to do something and it's part of the urban planning regulations or not, then we should simply say, yes, okay, so what can we do? What is there? What can we work with? What is not there? What do we want to start? For which purpose? What's the strategy? And all of a sudden, the design brief becomes less anthropocentric. Not that the humans are not in the center anymore, because you're still looking for them, but other things also come into the center. So this is where my belief comes in, that we cannot say, if we truly want sustainability, we cannot only prioritize the humans and everything is secondary, because then greening is literally very superficial. It's secondary or tertiary, sprinkling on some chocolate sprinkles onto the bread. No? It needs to come on the same level of priority, and that needs to be expressed accordingly in the brief or program, if you like, if you mean by program the requirements stated in the brief.
Yeah, that's true, but the overall encompassing requirements so that's what I'm saying. It's the brief comes from the client on one side, but it also, which I think programmatic plays a very important role, at least in this constellation that I have here, that what you've mentioned right now with the climate and the environment, that this leads the project towards a negotiation between the brief and the requirements in terms of spaces and rooms and the conditions of the sites.
Yeah, but we have to be careful. We cannot expect miracles from clients. Yeah, because clients are there for their own reasons. They may be representatives of investors that wish to make profit and all the rest of it. How a brief is formulated needs to arrive from a confluence of forward-thinking regulations, forward-thinking practitioners, and in a way stakeholder involvement, which is in a way difficult if your stakeholders are in part non-humans. But then somebody needs to represent them and their needs and rights. So I think the way in which a brief is made today follows an old model of making a brief. Sometimes this changes where the processes are more participatory and perhaps also for larger areas. But the question is, how can we now make this more standard? How can we arrive at a design brief? Who needs to be involved? What needs to be given for the design brief to not rely exclusively on a very, very brilliant client. Because we cannot expect from the client to also know all these things. No? So the client is just one out of several stakeholders, one of the operators, one of the agents that needs to be seen in connection with the others. And then we need to find new ways of arriving at the design brief. And the other big obstacle is, of course, exclusively short-term profit expectations. I think our economic considerations need to be upgraded. What governments already know, it's been calculated over and over again, is if you add one more bank holiday into a year, you get a loss of X in the gross domestic product, in the annual gross domestic product. If we know that for bank holiday, we also know that for sick days. If we know that an average worker is now sick 26 days a year, let's say, depending on context, and we factor that in, we can calculate what the loss in gross domestic product for this year will be. So we must have calculations that basically say that we're dealing with an economy. An economy is not only short-term profit. An economy has short-term, mid-term, long-term aspects. There are various factors that play into that. And we always need to see that maybe if we have a good indicator for a short-term profit, we still may have no good indicator for a long-term, well-working economy. Because it's not so simple as, okay, somebody made profit, puts the money back into the economy, and the whole thing keeps churning. These are sort of simplistic, old ideas about turbo capitalism. Yeah, and we know that these kinds of growth economy models that we're still working with predominantly today will have their limits. Just even in terms of physical resources that are there to be deployed. No? So we have the client on the one hand in determination of the brief, and we have also in kind of economical context within which certain things need to take place that needs revision. So to really do the work, we don't only have to, it's not enough to just work with environmental scientists, earth scientists, life scientists. We also need to work with economists. We need to try and find different ways of doing this. Whether that's possible on a project by project basis, I doubt. This is probably something that needs to come more from a national effort or from a regional effort of trying to think, how should the economy of this region, of this country or whatever, how should this work? And how do we facilitate things within that? And that will have knockback effects all the way down to the way architects calculate their fees. In Germany, for instance, the contract of architects has 10 different stages, 9 of which are delivery based, meaning, for instance, site research, you deliver some drawings in the scale such and such, and only 1 is time based, and that's project management, which typically is done for large scale projects like big clinics or airports, which are under almost permanent redevelopment. But what if this new model basically requires us to not just deliver a project, but to follow it up, to do more things, to do measurements, to understand what the knockback with the surroundings is, to deliver data sets to the city, to control and check that, which is something that would also expand the remit of our discipline at the point where maybe not so many people will design new buildings. All of a sudden, there are new areas of generalization and specialization. I want to come back to that point because you asked that question earlier on. But basically, where we simply have to see what are the preconditions. And the preconditions are manifold. It goes from the regulatory system to the way how we calculate things, to the way how we see what we deliver, to the way we understand our profession. And what I'm calling for is no less than a permanent critical revision of what is holding us back, or where are there friction points? Let's say not even to judge, but where are the friction points in wanting to do this and not being able to get there? Now, what is not working there? And that needs to be also the subject matter of research, and it needs to be the subject matter of training. I believe that young planners and architects don't get enough training in terms of economy and business models. How do they set themselves up? How can they think about future practice and all the rest of it? They don't get anything. You in order to get this, you need to subscribe to some sort of specialist courses or basically hope to learn that in practice. But to come back also to the question of the generalist and the specialist, this is an ongoing discussion. Where does our profession go?
Yeah.
Are architects per se generalists, or are we now looking at a period where there's an increasing amount of specialization? I believe you need to have both capacities. You need to have the capacity to think laterally and connect dots in different disciplines. And you also need to have the capacity to follow somebody down the rabbit hole of a specialist discourse. It doesn't mean that you have to be 50 specialists all in once, but you need to know some first principles somewhere. Yeah. So for me, this is again not an either or. Should an architect be a generalist or a specialist? An architect has to have the capacity of both without having to be a full encyclopedia or without having to be 50 specialists wrapped into one.
Yes, I think we have this, we inherited this model of the generalist who is, that it's not just a generalist, but is a generalist who is specialized in multiple directions from the Renaissance. All the Renaissance masters were masters in painting, in architecture, in law, in mathematics. So I think in a way we lost that in the last 100 years, but now it seems to somewhat come back, that we want to be again this overarching, overgrasping, almost demiurgic figure who has a grasp on everything and can control various aspects.
I think I would say now we can be smarter.
Yes.
And we can realize that no individual person can deliver this, but that we need to work in teams. Yeah, and that we are supplementing each other.
Yes.
I think that's a model that seems workable in terms of the complexities that we're facing. Mm-hmm. It would be somewhat misguided from my perspective to hope for some individual geniuses that will solve it all for us, because they are so amazingly good in everything.
Yes.
There won't be, maybe I will have to eat my words, but I think there won't be a contemporary Leonardo da Vinci who will solve the environmental issues for us. This is really a kind of major collective undertaking.
Yeah, this I think now derives into the psychology of what an architect feels has to do and what an architect has to do. Yeah, I want to fall back on what you mentioned before with economics and in terms of performance for the client. And I don't know, it was part of the brief that I sent you with this phenomenon of greenwashing. And there's this, it's not an anecdote now, it actually happened that at theoretician, a professor wrote an article about the firm and critiqued their project that they claim to be environmentally correct, but in fact they are doing greenwashing. So it is a form of Scheinheiligkeit, as I say in German. So it's moral posturing without substance. So how can architects, how can we guard against this combination of greenwashing and Scheinheiligkeit, and that these environmental ambitions are truly operative rather than superficial? And I think this ties to this idea of problematic, but I would like to have your perspective on that, on the matter of greenwashing.
On any matter, the ability of criticality and reflecting upon matters. I think too many things are taught and learned without knowing the exact consequences, because we take these as sort of like generic things that don't really do anything. But the way we draw a Schwarzplan, a figure ground plan, the way we draw sections through a building, all reinforce so the division of the technical objects and systems from their surroundings, if you like. So a critical ability, analysis,
We were talking about this, the greenwashing. And I don't know if you know the case that this professor was actually sued by the architecture firm for defamation, for the fact that he critiqued their approach in a specific project as greenwashing.
Okay. No, I don't know. There are lots of cases going on here, but here the cases like this are terrible, because that means that you can no longer voice a critique without facing the threat of being pursued. So if our profession is losing the will for, and the understanding that critique is, in a sense, also a kind of invitation to improve one's own delivery, if that's a problem, then yeah, I don't know, we're really in dire straits in our profession. Greenwashing, yes, it is a problem. It's also a bit of a double-sided sword, because a building that has 2% better performance in terms of, I don't know, any environmental issues than not, well, I would go for the 2% rather than not having it. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that I have to uncritically then embrace it. I can say, well, is this really all we can do?
Yeah.
I also always have to be very careful, because I'm very critical with a lot of also so-called state-of-the-art green buildings. If I would voice this more openly, I would probably also have a few legal cases on my back. But at the same time, we should not permanently live in fear. We should also speak our mind, because on the one hand, yes, we should not defame, but on the other hand, we should also not sell out our future out of fear.
I think this is like a general outlook nowadays. We should speak up. I would like also to talk about, you have a big project that you've been doing for quite a while right now. It's called Ecolobes. Could you outline a bit the project and what is an ecological building envelope?
The Ecolabs project is a Horizon 2020 research project financed by the European Union. And it took place, because it's finished now, in the Future and Emerging Technologies program, which is a high-risk research program. In other words, when you do something in such a program, it really has to not just be an incremental development of existing approaches, but it has to go radically beyond everything that exists. So we basically suggested that the most effective way to go past or beyond the limits of getting green cities and ecologically viable, livable cities is not to rely exclusively on leftover spaces for greening, or to put a little bit of green onto buildings. But what if we would think of the building envelope as really a place also for plants, animals, microbiota in the soil, therefore a lot of soil, and so on. And this, how could we imagine this kind of proximity between humans dwelling and on the other hand, all these other non-human stakeholders? And in the research project itself, we developed design technology. In the case of TU Vienna, we had several partners. We had Technical University Munich, we had the University in Genoa, we had the Technion in Haifa, we had McNeil Europe, who are the owners of Rhino and Grasshopper. And we had Studio Animal Aided Design, a practice from Munich on board. So in terms of TU Vienna, we developed design tools, computational design tools for the early design stage, which involved, first of all, building a relational database where we say, okay, what kind of data do we need for such a design? We need some environmental data, we need some ecological data, where's the data coming from, which kind of format have we, and can we visualize this data in our CAD environment, in this case, the Rhino Grasshopper. The second part is, so now you basically don't have an empty design space, a plot or parcel, but you have a plot or parcel with various data sets. And of course, because we're looking at ecological perspective here, we cannot look at the parcel alone. We need to look at a certain area around it. What is there even in terms of vegetation, in terms of animal life, and so on? So we decided to work with a square kilometer, could have also been something else, around the site. So, no, sorry, that's as a site, as a larger area around the plot.
Yeah.
So you see that from the instance you say ecology, you cannot just work with a plot alone. And then in order to make certain determinations, we had to ask, how would a design brief look like for an ecological project? So you would have ecological requirements together with architectural requirements. Then how would design cases, what are the main design cases that you work on in an architectural office? Typically a competition for a new master plan for an area where no building regulations exist, or you get a commission for designing a building where the building regulations exist. So we took all of this as a framework, and then we had our CAD environment with the necessary ecological and environmental data sets. So now you have to do something. You have to somehow visualize in your CAD environment the requirements from the brief, which means that you have to make decisions. Where do I put a certain ecological item? I don't know, a plant functional group or a tree or whatever. And where do I put a part of the architecture and so on? And here comes now the problem. We are not all trained in ecology. So how do we make these determinations? So we developed a design decision support system as a knowledge graph that you can query. You can say, can I put A next to B? Is this possible? Or show me all the areas for this particular plant species that have enough solar exposure for me to be able to plant this, or show me this, show me that. And then you get input. You begin to understand you can put something here, you cannot put something there. And
yeah. So this is in terms of data collection, what input you
no,
get
this is
from-
in terms of making the first determinations in the design without having an ecologist sitting next to you, or without having an environmental scientist sitting next to you. So you need to be able to ask your decision support system these questions. But what is contained in the decision support is we had to actually sit down together with the ecologists and the other specialists and try and make these determinations, because they are not written anywhere. It's not written that if these are the conditions you want, place your tree and your bush on this corner of the building at that height with so and so many. You don't get this. We need to discuss this with specialists and then express that as a series of rules or determinations, embed that in your decision support system so that the poor designer who's sitting there without any experts around can actually ask this to the computational design decision support system. And then we also developed a set of algorithms that develop a kind of spatial organization and the geometric articulation of the plot and the building. And basically, in order to arrive at something that is called landscape connectivity and ecological connectivity, we basically said the building cannot just be a typical extruded vertical face volume. We need another concept, and for that we developed the notion of urban landform as a continuous terrain and a kind of geometric system that works with that to then articulate the building. So you see, in order to do that, we already had to have architects, ecologists, computer scientists, geometers, all sorts of people sitting together to make determinations. No? And we needed also to understand where the limits of what we have produced are and how in future we would go beyond that. So at the end of this project, I discovered research done at the University of Oulu by a very interesting group of researchers there that look into the relationship between geodiversity, microclimate diversity, and biodiversity. They're basically saying if you have a diverse articulation of a terrain because of this geometry, because of the sun path, the weather direction, the wind exposure, you get different microclimates. Because of these different microclimates, you get different plant groups. And because of that, you might have different animals and all the rest of it. So this would be, for instance, something that I would embed into a second version of the Ecolabs project. And so you see, as you work on that, you have to read a lot of stuff from other disciplines. And you actually, if you have defined the problem to yourself in a good way, you will also be able to find approaches in other disciplines that would help you in the next steps of developing both the conceptual approach and the methods and the tools alongside with it. So Ecolabs in a way is quite radical because it basically says that this 2D view and the figure ground plan is basically our enemy because it says, here's the building. You cannot have open space and you cannot have green space. You can sprinkle some chocolate sprinkles over it, but there's no real connectivity there. The primary systems are the buildings as extruded and the infrastructure systems that exist, and then whatever is left over, then possibly green space. If you want to merge this by way of architectural and landscape architectural hybrid typologies, this requires a totally different thinking. It also doesn't work in 2D anymore. You need to work in 3 spatial dimensions across different scales, and you need to work also over time.
This was also, I got now a much more detailed and technical explanation. For me, I got the basis of this from a text of yours, which is a geomorphic tectonics, which says that we need to fight against discrete objects and focus on non-discrete architectures and a continuous landscape, which I suppose this is a base for the whole research. And this was part of the Vienna Story Studio, and I'm going to make a bit of a jump right now. And you, what I really enjoyed, because that's where I met you, I was just, as a student in the studio, there's a strong emphasis, you put a strong emphasis on research. So we have this huge research in the beginning, and then we dedicate a lot of substantial time on what we might call the conceptual orientation of the project. I will relate to it now as the problematic of the project. You are now what, 4th iteration of the studio? You're doing it this semester again. So what are your impressions? What can we say about problematics how students work, how students produce things? How do they begin to identify a problematic? Is it only environmental, what they deal with?
First of all, I must make each and every student who is joining my studio a massive compliment, because jumping into this experiment takes guts. And it also takes at least a good intuition that there is more out there to what we typically think of in narrow disciplinary terms. Yeah, so my biggest appreciation goes to the students, without whom this whole thing would not be possible. I also pursue a strategy to lay open as much as I possibly can where I'm coming from and why are we doing the things that we're doing from both a pedagogical perspective, but also a need perspective in terms of today's context. Why are we doing this? And it takes a great deal of trust, I must say, from students. In the past, I had students in other places, not at TU Vienna so much, but I had students that would say, well, Michael, this is all very interesting, but it's not architecture. Sorry, I can't take your studio. And my response is always, that's fair enough. But please tell me from your perspective, what is architecture? And typically, I don't get very much of an answer. At TU Vienna, I don't get these responses because the university is just too big. Now, people who would think like this would just simply not take my studio, and that's that. So you would never get this kind of feedback. But I'm seeing that as the studio is going through its iteration, there is now a more constant number of students, and it's always a very interesting international mix of students who also are willing to cope with the fact. Some have to cope with it. For others, it's an advantage that this is one of the few studios that's taught in English and that it's taught online, which is mainly due to the fact that we don't have enough teaching spaces at TU Vienna for 50% of the courses. So I basically said, let's make an advantage out of the seeming disadvantage. Now let's make it online so that everybody can participate no matter where they sit. They don't have to sit in Vienna. Let's make it in English so that everybody can participate. And then let's base this really on trust and interest. That is, to me, still one of the biggest things. Now, in the past, somebody told me, he was a psychoanalyst, very important teacher at the Architectural Association in London, who always said, ambition is the strongest building material. And it was perhaps correct for the AA at the time, where people like Zaha Hadid and Rem Koolhaas emerged and so on. But I think today, I think trust and interest are far more important than the ambition to be an individually recognized person. Maybe the ambition to do something relevant and significant is also still very important. So then we go from there. What am I trying to do in the... First of all, I consider myself a co-researcher. I'm not the person in the studio that knows all the answers to all the things. We are going together on a journey. I'm not the master, and the studio is not the atelier where people are replicating my style, because I don't have a style in terms of the topics that we're dealing with. That's why also the design outcomes are quite diverse. But it is more about a commitment to a number of collectively perceived important issues, I hope. So in the first iteration, we looked at human-nature interaction in cities. In the second one, we looked at soil bodies. In the third one, we looked in the hydrological cycle. That was also one of the ones that you participated together with the soil bodies. Now we're looking at the critical zone. I'm currently unsure whether there will be a fifth edition already in the next semester, or because there's another studio that needs doing and they need my help on that. So I don't know whether I need to temporarily suspend the Vienna stories. It's unclear at the moment. But if it happens next semester, I will look into, with the students, into the relation between geodiversity and biodiversity. So it's always a focal topic. But as you know, through your two experiences in the studio, there's a great deal of overlap, because these are never isolated topics. These are topics that are connected. The hydrological cycle is connected to the critical zone. the whole aspect of geodiversity, microclimatic diversity, biodiversity, something that can play out within the framework of the critical zone and so on. So these things are always, but I think each studio is making a research contribution in the initial phase. So it's a build up, we're building up a stock, and we're also trying to make these publications. As you know, you've been working on 2 of those, to record that, to make it, to not let it just be something that has been done and then forgotten, but that there's a record of those things. And that's also part of research. Where I remember an interesting definition of research that was presented by one of my colleagues, but at the UCL in London, Bartlett, and they were undergoing a national research framework exercise. They had to say what is research, and they basically phrased it in a few words. They said innovation leading to novelty that is effectively communicated. And the second part is important, because you can do any amount of research. If you don't effectively communicate it, you don't put it out there for your peers to critically reflect upon it, and you also simply just don't make it available to the profession. So I take the research that we're doing with the students so serious that I think it needs to be published and it needs to be shared with the profession, and somebody can take it, look at it critically, and develop it further.
No, but I do have to say that the research part was very interesting, and probably also due to the fact that I was in a group in the research part with whom, as you said, we trusted and we really cooperated. And we were like, I don't know, we set up the mirror board and we were like bees in the evening, 5 people working around this mirror board and putting up stuff, and then we were cross-checking with each other where we overlap, what did you find, what did I find, and then from this we put up quite a large amount, I think, of stuff in both iterations of the studio. So the research part for me was such a novel thing, strangely enough, in a studio, that we take this amount of time to actually look at research, and from then we focus on concept, and even to an equal amount, even more than the research part, but it was more about the concept than in the end producing floor plans and this crisp floor plans that, or an aesthetics out of the in our work. It was really enjoyable, I have to say, the whole process of the research, and then the putting the research to work in the problematic.
And think about that one step further. Maybe in the next iteration in your professional life, be this as a researcher or be this as a practitioner, maybe the next time it will not be 4 or 5 architects working together. Maybe you will be sitting there with an environmental scientist, maybe there will be an ecologist. And so 4 or 5 of you from different disciplines will be putting together this thing. Maybe that then becomes the basis for a design brief. So this kind of cooperation, it may seem trivial, but it is not at all trivial, because what you do there is you negotiate your findings with others into a meaningful whole. And in that particular instance, those others are of your same discipline, but they can also be of different disciplines. So this is a capacity from my perspective. It was also the fundamental capacity we needed to have to put something together in Ecolabs that goes beyond what we already know. We needed to be able to sit together in a room with people of different expertises from different disciplines, learn how to speak to one another, and put, in quotation marks, a meaningful Miro board together that resembled more than each of us individually would know, or even if you would line it up what we individually know, the whole has become more than the sum of its parts, because there's negotiated knowledge in there. It's not just what do you know, what do I know, and then we have a sum. It's like, what do you know, what do I know, and how do we put that into a meaningful relationship that has not been formulated yet?
Yeah.
Yeah, so basically what I'm trying to give, even in a modest way in the studio, we only meet 15 times, 16 times. It's not so very many times. But what I try to do there, at least in a modest way, is to replicate for you this experience that may become critical in your professional life that others haven't gained because they haven't gone through this experience.
Yeah, I think it already has. No way.
Yeah.
Yes, I think we're just a bit of a reflection point now. I think we touched on pretty much all the points, and it is a very encompassing, very rich talk from your side. I guess this is just a bit of a naive question, but what gives you hope about architecture's ability to meaningfully
You
engage?
hope about?
Architecture's ability to meaningfully engage with the world now. Are you hopeful about architecture's ability to engage with it? Can we still
Architectures,
make it? Can we still make a change? Do we still matter?
you mean the ability of architects to reinvent themselves? Is that what you
Yes.
mean? Okay, because when you say the ability of
Architecture
architecture,
itself, yeah, it's a bit impersonal, but also
no, but the architecture of what? As a discipline, as a set of buildings, is what does that refer to?
yes. No,
Yes.
all of this. Yes,
Okay, now
all of this.
let me put it like this.
Yeah.
I am very concerned about the state of our world in many ways, but let's, for the sake of this argument, say in environmental terms. But I don't want to feel disempowered. I want to feel that I can make contributions. So in a way, it's almost like a self-therapy. Yeah, but also, how can you project something if you don't see the possibility of light at the end of the tunnel? You need to believe in yourself based on your knowledge and on the intuition and other kinds of things. You need to believe it makes it makes sense to do what you're doing. So I'm very driven by that. And because of that, I try to find people of a similar inclination. And I'm always lucky to have, for instance, in the studios, to always have a handful of people with a similar inclination. You can never expect a whole studio to be like this. It's just nowhere like this. Not at the AA, nowhere. There's no place where a whole studio is, every single person is totally dedicated, brilliant, and all the rest of it. This just doesn't exist. But if you have in every student, in every studio, a handful, 3, 4, 5 people that are moving forward, that also takes the entire group with them. So it's not up to me. It's not, I cannot make this happen. The people that make this happen are the 3, 4, 5 students in the studio that are really on the task. They make it happen. I'm only the kind of assistant, so to speak, throwing in some rules and throwing in some other kinds of things and responding as best as I can on a day-to-day basis. But it's those 3 or 4 people. And what I really hope, although I never perhaps explicitly say, I always am very appreciative of the work, but what I hope comes through without me saying is the amount of trust that I place into the students. As expressed, for instance, by us doing these publications and all the rest of it. I think these are significant things, both in educational terms and in research terms, and in the collective spirit that we're building together. So if there's hope for architecture, it is that you, me, others that are sitting in the same boat nourish this collective spirit and that we try to work in an inclusive way. Then I think architecture can very well reinvent itself. The discipline can reinvent itself. By that, I don't mean that every architect will join us. Probably not. It might mean that some part of architecture will in the future just be exterior decorators. Yeah, but we will not be, because we are concerning ourselves with far more complex questions, and maybe in that process, almost everything begins to be problematized. For instance, in the work that we do, to ask the question, what role does aesthetic play in this whole thing when you foreground so many scientific aspects? These are interesting questions, and we should face them. And this is what makes our profession interesting. Somebody who would have listened to our conversation over the last hour and a bit might say, yeah, Michael, you're just complicating everything. You're making everything so complex. But I would say this is also what's making everything so interesting. Do you really want to sit there for 40 years and just be cat monkeying away and just doing the same thing over and over? Why there's no fulfillment in that? Fulfillment is in facing the music. Yeah. in making things interesting by saying, okay, here are a few things we take for granted, but what happens if we don't take them for granted? What if we start making them a matter of discussion? Yeah, somebody else might say, yeah, this is all good and interesting, but it's not very practice oriented. I would say it's very practice oriented. How do you keep your practice to be at the forefront if you don't problematize things? What did Ram Koolhaas do? What did Bernard Tschumi do? Well, except for those where it then becomes always an ism, here's our parametricism and here's our whatever, where it becomes a question of mere style, then I think it's somewhat dead, because that goes in the direction of exterior decorators. So everybody who will listen to this conversation, I hope there will be a few people who listen to it.
Yeah.
Please take this impetus to problematize. Yeah, you spoke about the problematic, but I call it problematizing. Take it as a positive thing, because that's what's making life interesting. You may not always be able to contradict your boss in every meeting and to say, hey, let's problematize it, but you can bring in certain things. And maybe at some point you might decide to run your own show because you're so good in what you're doing. There are not so many other people around doing the same thing. Better than becoming redundant. Problematize to make things interesting, to stay away from being redundant.
Yeah. I think that's a wonderful message. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you very much. That was great.